In the complex chessboard of Middle Eastern politics, few nations have maintained the strategic clarity of Algeria. While Iran pushed forward with bold high-stakes moves, backing proxy groups, challenging global powers, and refusing compromise, Algeria stood apart, warning against the dangers of unchecked regional ambition. At the time, many dismissed these warnings as cautious neutrality. But today, as Iran faces tightening sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and growing internal unrest, a striking realization is emerging. Algeria was right. What exactly did Algeria see that Iran chose to ignore? And how did a miscalculated strategy turn into a national crisis for Tehran? In this video, we uncover the early signs, the crucial decisions, and the unfolding consequences. Stay with us as we reveal how one country's foresight exposed another's costly mistake. To understand why Algeria's warnings were so significant, we need to go back and examine its geopolitical posture. Algeria has long positioned itself as a non-aligned, strategically cautious actor in international politics. Emerging from a brutal war of independence, Algeria developed a foreign policy rooted in sovereignty, diplomacy, and non-intervention. It rarely took sides in volatile Middle Eastern conflicts, choosing instead to advocate for regional stability, multilateralism, and de-escalation. When tensions began rising across the Middle East, Algeria consistently warned against military adventurism, sectarian polarization, and over-reliance on foreign powers. In contrast, Iran took a more aggressive path. Over the past 2 decades, Tehran has pursued an ambitious regional strategy built on 3 pillars: military influence through proxies, resistance to Western pressure, and the pursuit of nuclear capabilities. Through Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and militias in Syria and Iraq, Iran established a so-called axis of resistance aimed at countering U.S. and Israeli influence. It forged deep ties with the Assad regime during the Syrian civil war and openly supported Shiite movements across the region, often at the expense of diplomatic ties with Sunni Arab states. Iran's nuclear program became the centerpiece of global concern. While Iran claimed it was for peaceful purposes, its refusal to fully cooperate with international inspectors, coupled with its ballistic missile development, alarmed much of the international community. Although the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, offered a temporary diplomatic breakthrough, the U.S. withdrawal from the deal in 2018 reignited hostilities and prompted Iran to ramp up its enrichment activities again. Global powers have reacted differently to Iran's posture. The United States, under multiple administrations, has maintained a pressure campaign, relying on sanctions and regional containment. Israel has taken a more direct approach, targeting Iranian operatives and infrastructure in Syria. Saudi Arabia has viewed Iran's ambitions as a direct threat to Gulf stability, further polarizing the Sunni-Shiite divide. Russia and China, while diplomatically aligned with Iran at times, have also kept Tehran at arm's length, reluctant to fully invest in a partner so frequently at odds with the global order. Amid all this, Algeria watched the chessboard carefully, quiet, observant, but unwavering in its conviction that long-term stability could not be achieved through confrontation and militarization. Today, those warnings appear prophetic. Throughout modern Middle Eastern geopolitics, Algeria has maintained a consistent voice of caution and restraint. As a country that endured colonization, civil war, and foreign interference, Algeria developed a foreign policy doctrine rooted in sovereignty, non-intervention, and strategic independence. This doctrine, often described as principled neutrality, guided Algeria to avoid entanglements in proxy conflicts and discouraged military escalation as a tool for regional influence. While other nations rushed to form ideological or military alliances, Algeria refused to be drawn into sectarian divides or bloc politics. It stood apart from both Western and Eastern camps, aligning neither with NATO nor with aggressive anti-Western coalitions. Even in the face of mounting tensions between Iran and its regional adversaries, Algeria resisted calls to join either the anti-Iran axis or to lend overt support to Tehran's resistance strategy. Instead, Algerian officials and diplomats quietly warned of the risks posed by ideological expansionism and the militarization of diplomacy. Privately, and through multilateral forums such as the Arab League and the African Union, Algerian leaders emphasized that reliance on militias, interference in sovereign states, and escalation with global powers would only lead to isolation and long-term instability. Algeria expressed skepticism toward Iran's deepening involvement in Syria and Iraq, cautioning that these moves would alienate Tehran from its neighbors and undermine its economic and political future. Unlike Iran, which projected influence through proxy forces and confrontation, Algeria invested in diplomacy, energy partnerships, and economic cooperation. While Iran pushed a confrontational agenda that often triggered international sanctions and isolation, Algeria worked to maintain constructive relations with all sides: Europe, the Arab world, Russia, and even Iran itself. This stark contrast between Iran's assertiveness and Algeria's balance wasn't just ideological, it was strategic. Algeria saw that building influence through soft power, economic interdependence, and diplomatic neutrality would yield longer-term benefits than militarized regional dominance. It warned that ideological rigidity and over-reliance on foreign proxies could eventually lead to collapse, warnings that are now echoing with painful relevance in Tehran. Iran's strategic miscalculation was not a single decision, but a series of interconnected policies driven by a belief in regional dominance through ideological confrontation and asymmetric warfare. At the core of this approach was Iran's belief that its influence could be expanded through proxy militias, resistance narratives, and direct defiance of Western and regional adversaries. But as events unfolded over the last decade, it became increasingly clear that this strategy carried long-term costs that Iran either underestimated or simply ignored. One of the gravest errors was Iran's escalating confrontation with Israel. What began as rhetorical opposition evolved into direct action, particularly in Syria and Lebanon. Iran's military presence in Syria, under the cover of supporting the Assad regime, allowed it to establish weapons supply routes to Hezbollah and build military infrastructure near the Israeli border. This provoked regular Israeli airstrikes on Iranian assets in Syria, some of which reportedly killed senior officers from Iran's Revolutionary Guard. Rather than deter Israel, Iran's presence fueled a dangerous tit-for-tat conflict that dragged Tehran into a prolonged and costly shadow war. At the same time, Iran's support for Shiite militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and Hezbollah in Lebanon hardened sectarian divisions across the Middle East. This alienated key Arab states, particularly in the Gulf, who viewed Iran's actions as a direct threat to their sovereignty and regional balance. As a result, Tehran lost crucial diplomatic opportunities to normalize relations with neighbors, deepening its isolation within the Arab world. This over-reliance on proxy groups had other consequences. While Iran expanded its indirect reach, it simultaneously became entangled in conflicts that drained its resources and tarnished its image. For example, its support for the Houthis in Yemen led to accusations of prolonging a brutal civil war and contributing to one of the worst humanitarian crises of the 21st century. In Iraq, pro-Iran militias clashed with national forces and protesters, eroding public opinion even among Iraqi Shia populations. Economically, Iran paid a steep price. After the U.S. withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, in 2018, the Trump administration reimposed crippling sanctions under a maximum pressure campaign. These sanctions severely restricted Iran's oil exports, froze financial assets abroad, and isolated its banking sector from the global system. Inflation soared, the rial plummeted, and the cost of living rose dramatically. By doubling down on its nuclear program in response, Iran only intensified Western pressure and alienated potential European allies. The breakdown of nuclear negotiations further highlighted Tehran's rigid posture. Talks in Vienna stalled repeatedly as Iran demanded full sanctions relief before making any concessions, while Western negotiators grew increasingly frustrated with Iran's lack of transparency. Meanwhile, reports from the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, revealed alarming increases in uranium enrichment levels, sparking fears of weaponization and triggering new waves of international condemnation. Internally, these policies bred unrest. Economic hardship led to mass protests, often violently suppressed. Calls for reform grew louder as citizens questioned not only the regime's domestic policies, but also the enormous sums of money spent on foreign militias, while ordinary Iranians struggled with unemployment, water shortages, and inflation. Regionally, Iran's influence began to erode. Countries like Saudi Arabia, once firmly opposed to dialogue, have begun exploring alternative alliances and even direct talks with Israel. Unthinkable a decade ago. At the same time, the Abraham Accords, brokered by the U.S., saw several Arab states normalize ties with Israel, partly driven by shared concerns about Iran's behavior. Rather than uniting the region under a common anti-Israel stance, Iran's actions contributed to a realignment that left it more isolated than ever. In short, Iran's strategic error lay in overestimating the effectiveness of hard power and underestimating the value of diplomacy, flexibility, and regional trust. What was meant to be a show of strength has, over time, become a demonstration of strategic blindness, one that Algeria, with its cautious and balanced approach, saw coming long before the consequences became irreversible. The international response to Iran's strategy was swift, multifaceted, and in many cases, deeply punitive. As Tehran doubled down on its regional ambitions and nuclear escalation, world powers took increasingly aggressive steps to isolate and pressure the regime, both diplomatically and economically. The United States led the charge. After unilaterally withdrawing from the 2015 nuclear deal in 2018, the Trump administration launched the Maximum Pressure campaign, reimposing and expanding sanctions on Iranian oil, banking, shipping, and defense industries. These sanctions cut Iran off from key global markets, slashed its oil revenues, and severely weakened its economy. The Biden administration initially signaled openness to re-enter the nuclear deal, but Iran's intransigence and refusal to return to compliance stalled negotiations. By 2023, even Washington's tone had hardened, with officials warning that Iran's window for diplomacy was rapidly closing. The European Union, initially sympathetic to keeping the nuclear deal alive, grew increasingly critical. While EU leaders urged both sides to return to negotiations, they were alarmed by Iran's enrichment of uranium to near-weapons-grade levels and its failure to fully cooperate with the International Atomic Energy Agency, IEA. The EU's patience wore thin as Iran continued to make demands without offering meaningful compromises. Several European nations began to support additional sanctions targeting Iranian drone exports, particularly after their use in Ukraine by Russian forces, a development that further complicated Iran's global image. In the Arab world, Iran's actions triggered an even stronger backlash. The Arab League issued multiple condemnations of Iran's interference in Arab affairs, especially in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. Sunni-majority countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates saw Iran's growing influence through proxy groups as a direct threat to regional stability and security. These concerns played a major role in the regional realignments of recent years. Perhaps most notably, Iran's posture contributed to a major geopolitical shift, the Abraham Accords. For decades, normalization between Israel and the Arab world seemed impossible. Yet shared concerns over Iran's aggression prompted several Arab states, including the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, to formalize ties with Israel, reshaping the regional balance and sidelining Iran diplomatically. Even among Iran's historical allies, cracks began to form. Iraq, once a key strategic partner through its Shiite militias, grew uneasy with Iran's heavy-handed influence. Widespread protests in Iraq targeted Iranian interference, with demonstrators setting fire to Iranian consulates and calling for national sovereignty. In Syria, while Iran remained a vital backer of the Assad regime, Russia increasingly took the lead role in shaping the country's future. Tehran found itself outmaneuvered and sidelined, even in theaters where it had paid a heavy price to gain influence. Globally, Iran's growing alignment with Russia and China did little to relieve its isolation. While both countries supported Iran in opposing Western sanctions, neither was willing to offer unrestrained backing. China prioritized its energy security and regional trade, while Russia's war in Ukraine complicated its ability to support Iranian ambitions. Both countries maintained transactional, not ideological, relations with Tehran. In short, Iran's strategic error not only alienated the West and its regional neighbors, it gradually eroded its influence in once friendly territories. As Tehran's circle of trust narrowed, Algeria's warnings of diplomatic overreach and regional overextension appeared increasingly prescient. While Iran faced increasing isolation due to its confrontational policies, Algeria quietly rose in diplomatic stature, through a strategy of measured neutrality, non-intervention, and constructive engagement. Where Tehran chose ideological rigidity and military entanglements, Algiers pursued balance, dialogue, and economic diplomacy, earning respect on multiple fronts without provoking conflict. In the Arab world, Algeria's consistent refusal to interfere in the internal affairs of neighboring states positioned it as a stabilizing force. Unlike Iran, which supported proxy groups across the region, Algeria advocated for Arab unity, sovereignty, and peaceful resolution of conflicts. It maintained cordial relations with both Sunni and Shiite nations, refused to be drawn into sectarian alliances, and emphasized political solutions over military interventions, an approach that earned the trust of various governments, even those deeply divided on other issues. Within Africa, Algeria continued to exert influence through its historical leadership in anti-colonial movements and its diplomatic engagement in regional security. It played key roles in mediating crises in Mali, Libya, and the Sahel, offering its capital as a neutral ground for dialogue. As a founding member of the African Union and a longtime proponent of Pan-Africanism, Algeria's diplomatic credibility extended well beyond North Africa, allowing it to emerge as a voice of balance in a volatile continent. Perhaps most significantly, Algeria's energy sector gave it newfound leverage in Europe. As the war in Ukraine disrupted Russian gas supplies to the continent, European nations scrambled to diversify their energy sources. Algeria, with vast reserves of natural gas and established pipelines to southern Europe, stepped in to fill the gap. Italy, Spain, and France deepened their energy partnerships with Algiers, elevating Algeria's strategic importance in European security and economic planning. Unlike Iran, whose oil exports were choked by sanctions, Algeria benefited from the global energy crisis, using its resources not as a weapon, but as a tool of constructive engagement. The result was increased foreign investment, stronger bilateral ties, and a role in shaping energy diplomacy in the Mediterranean. On the international stage, Algeria's principled foreign policy gained quiet praise. It remained a reliable voice in the non-aligned movement, promoted dialogue at the United Nations, and resisted pressure to align with any global bloc. As other countries stumbled into costly rivalries, Algeria stayed focused on internal development, regional mediation, and preserving its independence in an increasingly polarized world. In comparison, Iran found itself increasingly boxed in, pressured from the West, distrusted by its neighbors, and dependent on alliances of convenience. Algeria, by contrast, projected influence not through force, but through restraint, a subtle but powerful contrast that underscored the consequences of Tehran's strategic missteps. The consequences of Iran's strategic miscalculations have been both deep and far-reaching, felt most acutely within its own borders. Years of confrontational foreign policy, economic mismanagement, and political repression have culminated in a perfect storm of crises, many of which Algeria subtly warned against through its more restrained approach to regional politics. Domestically, Iran has faced waves of unrest driven by economic despair, political dissatisfaction, and social frustration. The country's economy, strangled by sanctions and weakened by internal corruption, has seen a dramatic collapse. Oil exports, once Iran's economic lifeline, plummeted under US and EU restrictions, slashing government revenue. As a result, inflation soared, essential goods became scarce, and the national currency, the rial, lost much of its value. Families across Iran struggled with rising food and energy costs, while youth unemployment reached alarming levels. These economic pressures sparked massive public protests, some of the largest since the Islamic Revolution. Demonstrations erupted in cities across the country, not only over prices and wages, but over systemic repression and foreign policy decisions. Protesters increasingly questioned why billions were being spent on foreign militias in Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen, while Iranian citizens endured daily hardship. In 2022, and again in 2023, the protests took on a broader, more defiant tone, with demands for systemic reform and even regime change. The government responded with crackdowns, arrests, and internet blackouts, but the anger continued to simmer. Internationally, Iran's credibility diminished. Once seen by some as a voice of resistance in the Islamic world, Tehran increasingly appeared as an isolated, rigid regime clinging to outdated strategies. Its refusal to compromise on nuclear negotiations, coupled with support for militant actors, alienated not just Western governments, but also neutral and even friendly states. Iran became a high-risk partner, distrusted by investors, and sidelined in key diplomatic arenas. These developments echoed the very warnings Algeria had voiced for years, though often quietly and diplomatically. Algiers had cautioned against ideological overreach, warned that foreign entanglements could backfire, and stressed that a country's legitimacy begins at home. Iran's path, marked by external expansion and internal repression, defied this logic, and the consequences now stand in stark contrast to Algeria's trajectory. Where Algeria preserves stability through diplomacy and economic cooperation, Iran finds itself battling domestic rebellion, economic ruin, and international isolation. It is a cautionary tale of what happens when long-term diplomacy is sacrificed for short-term geopolitical theatrics, something Algeria understood from the start. As Iran stands at a crossroads, the future remains uncertain, but not without possibilities. Mounting internal pressure, economic desperation, and shifting regional dynamics may force Tehran to reconsider its course. The question is whether the regime will adapt in time or whether it will double down on the very policies that have led to its current crisis. One scenario is that Iran may attempt to re-engage with the international community. Faced with severe sanctions and a struggling economy, pragmatic elements within the government might push for a return to diplomacy, reviving nuclear talks, easing tensions with neighbors, and moderating its regional posture. A more balanced foreign policy could gradually restore Iran's standing, but this would require significant political will and a willingness to confront hardline elements within the regime. However, regime survival remains uncertain. If domestic unrest intensifies and reforms are resisted, Iran could face a prolonged period of instability. The growing disconnect between the ruling elite and the population, particularly the younger generation, risks triggering deeper societal fractures. The regime's ability to maintain control through repression alone may be tested in ways not seen since 1979. In this evolving context, Algeria could emerge as a quiet but influential mediator. With its long-standing policy of neutrality, credibility in both the Arab and non-aligned worlds, and increasing global relevance due to its energy exports, Algeria is uniquely positioned to facilitate dialogue. It could serve as a bridge between Iran and the West, or between rival Arab states and Tehran, helping to de-escalate tensions without taking sides. Whether the global community will give Iran another chance depends largely on Tehran's next moves. A genuine shift in tone and policy could open the door to renewed negotiations and partial reintegration. But if Iran continues on its current path, further isolation seems inevitable. Meanwhile, Algeria's consistent, stable diplomacy has laid the groundwork for a larger role in regional affairs, one built not on force but on foresight. In the end, the contrast could not be clearer. Algeria saw the iceberg, but Iran sailed straight into it. While Tehran pursued a path of confrontation, proxy warfare, and ideological expansion, Algiers remained grounded in a strategy of balance, caution, and long-term diplomacy. Iran's miscalculations, once seen as bold defiance, have now brought it to the brink of economic collapse and international isolation. Algeria's quiet warnings, once overlooked, now echo with a new clarity. The difference between the two nations wasn't just in tactics, it was in vision. One chose to build influence through trust and stability, the other through fear and defiance. Now, as Iran faces growing unrest and a narrowing set of options, the question remains, will it finally change course and seek a new direction, or has the damage already gone too deep? The world is watching, and so is Algeria. If you found this analysis eye-opening, make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into global strategy and geopolitics. Your engagement helps us bring you the most insightful content. Don't miss out on future updates. Stay informed and be part of the conversation.